Hello, everyone. I'm Keith Testone, and this is HeroesX Office Hours for v14 of HeroesX. And I'm here as usual with Greg and Sarah and Jenna and Aylin. And we're going to talk about the discussion questions for hours 12 and 13. The hour 12 question that Greg posed is, we can say that Homeric poetry, unlike Hesiodic poetry, does not address directly this question, what is justice and what is injustice? But can we say that Homeric poetry does not address this question, what is right and what is wrong? What did folks have to say about this one?
Well, one of them has a mention of Odyssey Rhapsody 3, and he quotes the passage where there was a disastrous homecoming for many of the Greeks. And he talks about the Achaeans had destroyed the city of Priam, and then it was Zeus devised in his thinking a plan to make a disastrous homecoming, Nestor, for the guys, for they had not all been either mindful, having nos, or just dikē.
Yeah.
So you have a mention of the dikē there.
Yes, and it's explicit, it's undeniable, it's almost Hesiodic. But interestingly, it's something that is not said by the master narrator. It's said by a speaker who is a model for a safe homecoming. And the exception, therefore, is not owned, may I put it this way, by the master narrator. I have a similar situation to analyze with all of you, and that is where I would say, at least, that the master narrator of the Iliad, the master narrator of the Odyssey, in both cases, does not mention immortalization after death. But then in Odyssey 4, there's a very clear example, which is how Proteus predicts that Menelaus will have immortality after death. It's not, may I say it in a funny way, Homer who predicts it or who gives any indication. It's Homer quoting a speaker. I actually draw attention to this beautiful passage where Nestor is speaking in Odyssey 3, and I even suggest that this is exceptional, how rare it is in Homeric poetry to talk about matters of what is just and what is unjust, what is a mark of dikē and what is not, dikē in a long-term sense. But there it is. And also in the Iliad, the few exceptions that I find to my generalization that the Iliad and Odyssey don't talk about just and unjust as criteria, is a simile where the onslaught of the Achaeans is compared to the anger of Zeus, who is punishing a population by way of a devastating thunderstorm, and where again the reason that is given for this act of punishing a population is that they were acting without dikē. But again, instead of having a flat-out statement in the Iliad that the Trojans are the ones without dikē and the Achaeans are the ones with dikē is missing. So a very acute observation, and I'm meditating on how exceptions, when they occur in the Iliad and the Odyssey, at least as I see those exceptions, are generally, shall we say, one step removed from the master narrator.
One of the participants mentioned Ksenia. We see the suitors and they are not acting properly and not obeying Ksenia's rules per se. Can we expand, can we say Ksenia is a good example of showing right and wrong in Homeric poetry?
Absolutely. It is a way of showing what's right and what's wrong, except that it is a measure of moral behavior that does not invoke the measure itself. The way of measuring what's right and wrong, as we would say in English, is not in terms of dikē and lack of dikē, at least in Homeric poetry. Now, that's not saying that in other poetry, like Hesiodic poetry, you could say that. Of course you could. But it's just that those terms are missing in a narrative of the shock value of what the suitors are doing, and let's unpack why it's morally shocking what they're doing, and before we circle back to the question of dikē and the absence of dikē. What's outrageous, of course, is the fact that even if the suitors were the owners of the palace of Odysseus, even if they were the rightful owners, and therefore the hosts, when somebody comes and is expecting the protocols of what happens between guests and hosts, they would already be morally defective. But to make it worse, they're the real guests because it's not their property, it's Odysseus's property. And in a sense, then they are the uninvited guests to start with. So if they're going to be not generous with guests who say, well, why aren't you a host to me? That's a double wrong. Now, again, I'm saying this in terms of English, right and wrong. And I'm not saying that the Iliad and the Odyssey are not vehicles for our judging what's right and wrong. All I'm saying is that the master narrator doesn't use the words dikē and hubris as a kind of laser sharp measure about what is right or wrong. And so that's the difference. I come back full circle to, it's a difference between Homeric and Hesiodic poetry.
Another example that has come up in terms of thinking about right or wrong behavior, again, not with those terms, dikē and hubris, they're thinking again about Nestor and his advice. And again, that's not the master narrator, but it's an ainos, so the listener, Antilochus, must be mentally and emotionally qualified, also morally qualified. That is some sort of knowing right from wrong, if you, in one sense. And then they're also considering how Antilochus ends up not within Homeric poetry, but also not within Hesiodic poetry, dying for trying to rescue his father. Is that related to the ascending scale of affection alone, or is there something to do with doing the right thing and using that judgment, not in the race, but perhaps in his attempt to rescue his father?
Yes. Somehow, and I may not be able to prove it, but I have a sense, that's why I say somehow, that Homeric poetry recognizes the future of Antilochus. In other words, may I put it in a playful way? Back then, everybody knew that Antilochus died for his father. So that's already a given in everything that happens in the Iliad, just as everybody knew that Achilles would die in a way that's very similar to the way Patroclus dies in Iliad 16. So there are certain givens that would have been so much easier in the ancient song culture than they are for us.
So can we say that Homeric poetry indicates, not explicitly says, what the
Yes.
poetry thinks?
Yes, it does indicate, and I like the way, dear Janet, you use the word indicate. And in Greek, that would be semainein, wouldn't it? It would be encoding. On the other hand, it's also fair to say that the Iliad and the Odyssey are very user-friendly. You don't have to be all that hardwired, so to speak, with everything that is important in the ancient Greek epic tradition. I'll give an example. The Iliad spoils you by having a catalog of ships in the 10th year. Why 10th year? Catalog of ships should really happen in the first year of the Trojan War, not in the 10th year. Also, when Helen is introduced for the first time in the Iliad, it's as if we saw her for the very first time, isn't it? So there are user-friendly, or how shall I say it? I hate to use the word audience, but audience-friendly reintroductions. But I still say there is a lot of presupposed knowledge. And a comfortable way for me to think about it is that in an ancient Greek song culture, people would be growing up on this song culture. So in a sense, it is nice if you're a 6-year-old, if you hear the basic story for the first time in a public event. I'm making up the 6-year-old. It's kind of nice that you're introduced to Helen in the Iliad, because maybe this is your first time if you're a 6-year-old. It certainly won't be your first time if you're a 66-year-old. So I'm playing with different levels of hardwiring for different age groups. Similarly, rosy-fingered dawn or rosy-toed dawn. When you hear it for the first time, you may not have a full set of imagination for how the dawn rises. But by the time you hear it 999 times in your lifetime, you have a pretty good idea of what the poetic experience of dawn is and what your own experience of dawn is, because you've had the privilege of living through many risings of the sun yourself.
Well, I hate to leave that, but why don't we turn to hour 13? The question from Greg is, how do your readings in Herodotus help you see more clearly the nature of heroes in the Homeric Iliad and Odyssey? Give a specific example, please.
Okay. One participant mentions Solon. Okay, so Solon's musing that no one among the living is obvious, and also in relation to Croesus who, with the story of Croesus, we know that it depends in part on the nature of one's death. So that's one, point that he sees in Herodotus, is that the obvious is in relation with the death of the person.
Yes, yes. I think our participant has it well formulated and well understood, I think. However, I don't expect first timers with the Iliad and the Odyssey to be hardwired about this basic teaching about obios, when it's okay to say it and when it's not okay to say it, when it's not yet okay to say it. So in a sense, this is a situation where it's much more clear in Herodotus than it is in Homeric poetry. But I do see the same lesson in Homeric poetry, especially by the time we get to Odyssey 24.
Someone else has been picking up on that difference between the everyday meaning of certain words and then the deeper meaning of those words, which are hinted at in a way in Homeric poetry, perhaps a little more explicit in Hesiodic poetry. And then when we come to Herodotus, it's much more explicit, which then throws further clarification on what's being said in Homeric poetry. Yes. And examples, as we've been discussing to some extent already, has been dikē and hubris, but there are other examples
yes.
that
yes.
participants have been picking up on. So,
and what I'd like to say to people is that after you read the Iliad, it's not that you can forget it. You have to keep coming back to it when you read the Odyssey, and then when you read the Odyssey, you can't forget that. So you have to keep coming back to that as well, and the way it comes back to the Iliad, and for me at least, my reading of Herodotus is very similar. You can't just read it without going back, and I'm not saying that you have to go back in the sequence that I just outlined, that you simply just must go back in that sequence. So in a sense, then wouldn't I be saying, well, you should really read Herodotus first, then go back to Odyssey, then go back to Iliad? Of course not. In a sense, you have to keep going forward each time, but reaching all the way back. And there's so many ways of doing it. It's to me perfectly understandable if some professor presides over a course on Greek literature and translation where they skip the Iliad. I guess that's okay. You still get most of what you want to get, because these media in some ways are very user-friendly, but in other ways very demanding.
One of the participants mentioned two Hades scenes in Odyssey 11 and 24. So Achilles and Agamemnon are there and they are dead. So I want to, in terms of our understanding of dead and unwelting glory and chaos, these heroes, are they dead?
Well, this year I catch myself saying something differently than I had been saying it in previous years. When we talk about psyche, in ancient Greek Hero in 24 Hours, I programmatically define psyche as your breath of life when you're alive, and then your disembodied conveyor of identity when you're dead. And I notice that this year I catch myself saying not disembodied conveyor of identity after death, but disembodied conveyor of life after death. And then I think to myself, whoa, that's not the same thing. It's not quite the same thing. It's a deeper way of saying it. It is life after death. And if I say identity after death, I am skimming the surface. So in a way, I accidentally went deeper by using the turn of phrase differently, by saying disembodied conveyor of life after death. You know, linguists talk about immediate constituents, where let's say there are 3 words, and two of the words are stuck together, and one word is not stuck to the other 2 words. So in this case, could I say that if you say life after death, if I use my old definition, disembodied conveyor of identity after death, then may I say it in a funny way? I put a comma after identity. Jane Austen would put maybe, I'm joking, a semicolon instead of a comma. But that's one kind of immediate constituency, disembodied conveyor of life after death. And that's the conveyance, not life, you see. But if I say disembodied conveyor of life hyphen after hyphen death, then the immediate constituents are different. Then the real focus is, what would it be life? What would it be after death? We all know what life is before death. It's what Achilles' so passionately values in Iliad 9, where he says, I really value my life, my breath of life, my psyche. But this is different, isn't it?
Well, is there anything else we should cover? I love that.
Well, there's everything we should cover. We've only just begun.
Well, there was a mention of the story of Cleobis and Biton, and that's, I think, goes back to the seasonality being on time for one's death, which I think you talk about in H24H.
Yes.
But that was something that was discussed quite early on in the Homeric poetry as well. So hopefully that's another connection, I think, that people are making.
There's so many, and I'm so glad you mentioned Cleobis and Biton. And then there's that more mystical and more difficult to understand earlier story about Telos. And I think really, if we think about the etymology of that name, which I think is coded and must be related to just plain telos with a single L, which is a coming full circle. It can mean, telos can mean a successful successful experience of an initiation. That is to say, a successful passing through from one stage of life to another. It's all there. It's built in.
Well, I guess the circle will have to continue next time.
Okay,
So.
we'll keep circling around.
Exactly.
The cycle keeps recycling.
Good to see you all again. Thanks for joining me.